Most bankers aren't ready to help you until after their third cup of coffee. But with Central National Bank's after-hours service, you don't have to wait for the bank lobby to open to get help. You can contact us from 6 to 8:30 in the morning or from 5 to 10 in the evening, and we'll connect you to a real, live, local person who can answer questions and fix problems 7 days a week. Bank different. Bank Central. Central National Bank. Member FDIC.
Coming up on the Payoff, Harry Cunnane carries the message, and there's a reason why he does this stuff for a living. He's written 2 books about recovery that we get into and talk about here. His mother, a politician, successful politician, Madeleine Dean, as he was bottoming out, she was starting up her first major campaign for the state house in Pennsylvania. And the story as to how he got to that bottom and to how he recovered into a life now, which is an amazing one, is quite compelling, quite entertaining, but most importantly, it's inspiring. This is a guy who faced, from a affluent suburb outside of Philadelphia, and he's there in his 20s, and he's in the middle of a home invasion that at that point in time, with all the drugs he was doing and the place his life had gone, it was business as usual. And now business as usual for him is his beautiful family, his successful career, and sharing stories like his with people like us so we can help, hopefully, maybe somebody like you if you're struggling and you're listening today. All right, so this is a great conversation coming up with Harry Cunnane. But first, some great music. Kevin Souza. Your story, I think, is so important because, and I was speaking with Caron about this last week, who helped set this up. There's not a lot of people with, in my experience, being over 10 years sober now. I know you're right around 10 years. With time, the opioid epidemic is so new that there's not a lot of people with, you're coming up on 10 years with a lot of time. That have recovered from opioid addiction. Is that something you have seen, in your experience, where it's relatively new? So people with a lot of time, that's rare.
I've definitely seen that, and through different programs that I got involved in early in my recovery, what I really focused on early on, because I couldn't always identify people with a lot of time, specifically with an opioid disorder, was, whether it was someone talking about alcohol, someone talking about methamphetamine, whatever it was, to just find those similarities. But what's been remarkable is, so I have about 9.5 years now, and the amount of people that are out there that are building time and have that time now for people who are just coming into this, is, I think, just incredibly remarkable. How many people in recovery that have this lived experience are there to help the next guy or girl that comes into the program who's out there struggling with opioids today? Because what I've seen, more than anything, is just how much more deadly an opioid addiction has become from 2012, when I entered into recovery, to really the game of roulette that it is today, where you don't know what you're getting.
Yeah, and in the rooms of recovery, we work as an alcoholic and drug addict. I can speak for myself. You work to compare yourself out. So to walk into a room with a bunch of just old school drunks who are there to help you and who have the solution. But if you're looking to say, hey, I don't belong to this group, there's nobody here that, for me, I've had an Adderall addiction or a cocaine addiction, or now it's more and more current, hey, they don't have an opioid addiction. It's just another reason to leave. So I think people like you that are in the rooms, that are in recovery, that are outspoken like this, that are helping to break the stigma, I think it's a huge step.
Absolutely. There's incredible power in just the number of stories that are out there, because everybody can find a way to relate with somebody. I remember going to, 12-step meetings early on, and people kept telling me, if I don't relate, if I don't hear my story yet, keep coming and I will. And I found that to be the case. And as I listened more and got further into my recovery process, I could really see truly, though, that, those surface level pieces that I could identify with early on aren't as important, right? What's important is what we went through and what we're trying to do collectively in terms of trying to strive for recovery, strive to, put the drugs down, but more importantly, strive to just grow and be better people. So finding the ability to relate on that deeper level for me came later, but it is dangerous in the beginning because it's so easy to find and really pick apart anything that doesn't match with, and I'll say for me, that didn't match with my experience, to say I'm different. This might work for you, but it's not going to work for me, and this is why. So to break down those barriers and get as many stories of recovery out there as possible, I think is just so beneficial to everybody who's trying to find their way along this path.
Well, two of the stories that you've gotten out there personally, Under Our Roof is a book that was published about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. You wrote with your mother, Madeleine Dean, who's a politician, a successful politician, and then you wrote one with your wife, You Are Always Loved. And it's it's a children's book, and it can help break the stigma of addiction. Now, obviously, we'll thread these books and these messages into our conversation, but I want to go back to you as a child. You remind me a lot of myself because your mother writes or says, you were an outgoing kid. You always had a gang of people around you. You had a light coming off you. This is before the alcohol and drugs, but internally, you, like I, and like many other alcoholics, if they're listening, can relate to this. You felt like you didn't get the playbook to life. You felt like there's a manual that everybody else has that I haven't gotten.
Absolutely. And I'll quickly just correct you to say, so both of the books, my mom and I did them together and are on the title, but you are right in highlighting my wife, Juliet, who I could not have done the work on either of them to put those stories out there.
All right.
But to your point, that my childhood, I was, externally, I looked really popular. I was always surrounded with people. And the more that I've unpacked, my emotions and my experiences as I've been in recovery, what I recognized was a pretty simple feeling once I identified it. And that was that I had this underlying fear that if people really knew me, if they got to know who I really was, what was really happening in my mind, then they wouldn't accept me. So I always surrounded myself with people for validation, for fun, and so that I didn't have to sit with myself. And that little fear of a lack of being accepted, once the drugs came into the picture, just grew exponentially, because then I really was living in a way that a lot of people weren't going to accept and weren't going to be happy about, and just built shame on top of shame, to where, I just felt like I couldn't get out.
Yeah.
But you couldn't, if you looked at me as a 8-year-old, you would have never seen that, because I wouldn't show it. I was afraid to show how I felt.
I love how you say, by the way, towards the end of your, and I love it because I can relate to it, towards the end of your addiction, you said, you would have rather died than have sat down with your parents and told them what was really going on with you, because there was so much shame attached to that. And I think that can keep a lot of people drunk and a lot of people high, or even in recovery, sober people, that can keep them wrestling with whatever demons they have going on that they haven't shared with people.
Absolutely. And that, that built over time, right? I remember for me, I did, I had education programming in school about drugs and alcohol. And my takeaway at the time was drugs are bad. Alcohol is bad. If you do them, you're bad.
Yeah.
And, when I first started and found a way to sort of justify drinking or smoking for the first time, it felt okay. But that deep held belief that this is wrong stuck with me and is so powerful, to the sense of, I wrote about in the book an experience where, I was having testing done at the hospital, And, I went into anaphylactic shock. And I'll never know whether that was a direct result of being on drugs and not disclosing what I was on. But I'm sitting there, I'm high on opioids, and they're doing this procedure, and all of a sudden my throat is closing. The doctor is, giving me shots of epinephrine, trying to sort of stop my body from going into anaphylactic shock, and they just keep asking, is there anything you're not telling us? And in spite of my throat physically closing, I couldn't say it. I'd rather not say it, so I sat there just in this pain of, it is what it is. I can't get through this because I can't let anybody else know what's really going on.
Were you
in spite of that crisis?
Were you there for what kind of testing were you having done? Was it stuff that was induced by the drug usage, or was it just regular tests?
So it was because of the drug usage. So part of my experience was I was using opioids, and I would throw up daily. Every morning I would be woken up and have to throw up first thing in the morning. And I did that for probably a couple of years. And I also wasn't eating well. So my health, I looked horrible. I was, incredibly underweight. I was throwing up. And as a justification to my family of why I looked like this, I didn't tell them that I was using drugs, but I told them, there's something going on with my stomach. I throw up every day. So I started undergoing all of these tests and seeing specialist after specialist, having endoscopies done. They're trying to figure out what is causing this. And I put my whole family through this ordeal of all of these doctor's visits, all of these endoscopies, when really I knew, right? I knew what was causing it. But it was, and I think for my mom as well, it was less painful to think that maybe it was some other underlying medical condition and that it wasn't a substance use disorder. So I was undergoing some allergy testing to try to figure out, they thought I had this condition called eosinophilic esophagitis. That's what I was trying to start to blame rather than substance use.
Yeah, I similarly had a heart problem that was brought on by substance use, and it was cardiomyopathy, which was, long story short, pretty much induced alcohol and drugs. At least that's what we think now. But at the time, I wouldn't admit it. They were like, "Hey, how do you think you got this?" I was like, "I don't know." They were like, "Well," they were like, "A virus could have gone through your body or attacked it, and that's how your heart muscle was screwed up, or you could have gotten it through taking drugs and drinking." And I was like, "Oh, virus for sure," because I didn't want anybody to get in the way of the alcohol and drug usage. And that, for a regular person to identify with, is tough. But for one addict talking to another, it's business as usual.
It does feel like business as usual. But I think it's always important to highlight that when the addiction starts, those things aren't usual, right? They become the normal. But, if I were to start and the first time I used drugs, all of those consequences happen, very likely I would have stopped. But in the beginning, they were working in terms of giving me this emotional sort of release and sense of peace that I was seeking that worked until it didn't, and then all of these consequences. And it was this internal battle of just trying to maintain once it had gotten too deep. And I think that's where, it's just so important to highlight these stories and talk about what can happen, what does happen. And again, also to really highlight that recovery is possible, so that if you do find yourself there, to know that it's not hopeless, that there is a way out. Recovery can look different, but you can absolutely live a better life than that.
Let's go back to the beginning for you. What the first time you got drunk or high, the first time you mentioned it worked for you, when was that?
So it was the second time I drank. The first time I drank, I didn't feel the effects. I didn't drink enough to get drunk. But even without feeling the effects, I still went back and tried it again. But, the first time I got drunk, I was probably 13 or 14. And, I'm in this field drinking with a bunch of friends. And I just remember this sort of like overwhelming sense of kind of just feeling like I belonged, that feeling that I had as a kid surrounded by friends and having this social anxiety of, will people accept me? All of that washed away. And I just had this sense of belonging with the people that I was with. It felt like I was in this community. We were in it together. We were all experiencing the same thing. And it was just euphoric. And for me, from that moment on, there wasn't, physical dependence right away, but that obsession really started for me almost immediately, because I knew as soon as I felt that, I wanted to feel it again.
I hear people say in recovery and 12-step meetings, you get from the program and working with other alcoholics and having a spiritual connection, the same thing that you got from alcohol and drugs. And what you just described, right? Everything washed away. You were in the moment, and that sense of community and camaraderie. That's what you can get on the other side of all this stuff in recovery. And so it's like the thing that we wanted the whole time is there in a healthy manner, but we have no clue. At least for me, I had no clue, because I felt the same way. When you get started, it's that, I wanted to be a part of. So now you feel a part of through drinking. How does it progress for you?
First, I love that analogy, because it really is through recovery I found all of those things that I thought I was seeking through drugs and alcohol. But for me, it progressed from there, pretty quickly. I recognized quickly that, I could only drink at that time kind of on the weekends. And
where'd you grow up, by the way?
Outside,
just for people that don't know, outside Philly, right? Or around the Philly?
Outside of Philadelphia.
Okay.
Yes.
Where'd you go to high school?
I went to St. Joe's Prep.
Oh, no kidding. I went to
Yeah.
Archbishop Carroll. Okay.
Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so grew up there. And for me, so then that next step was, recognizing that I loved the way alcohol made me feel mentally, but I didn't it upset my stomach. But I would push through that. So I started quickly smoking marijuana. And for me, it gave me a lot of that same euphoria without upsetting my stomach. And it was also something that I realized that I could do during the day.
Yeah, I was just about to say, you can do that.
A little bit less noticeable to, smoke in school or, kind of throughout the day at different times. And really following that same trajectory, by the time I was 16, I found cocaine. And for me, cocaine at that time offered all of those things. It didn't have the smell. I wasn't necessarily slurring my words. In hindsight, it must have been pretty apparent, but I was convinced that nobody knew, right? That I had this tiny amount of drugs in my pocket that I could use during the day. Nobody could know, but I could feel this feeling all day long. And that's what I had always craved, was how do I maximize my ability to feel like this? So continuing on with that, and that was a much more expensive habit, and it got, a little bit more complicated. But
how often were you doing cocaine in high school?
All the time. So really it was, dependent on what I could afford, but, most days in school, in the bathroom, day in and day out. The marijuana was still consistent. That was every day, but anytime I had the opportunity to be able to afford cocaine, I was doing it. And then that led me to opiates.
How were you doing in school, by the way?
Painkillers. So my thing was, my grades were doing okay. And this is, let's say, kind of junior going into senior year. Junior year is where the cocaine really started. And then senior year, everything was really kind of a mess externally, but my grades were decent at the time. And I did really, really well on my SAT. So I applied to 13 colleges, and I got accepted into all but one of them. I got one wait list, and they were all, early applications. So I knew early in the fall, my senior year, that I had about 10 academic scholarships. I was going to school, and it justified that what I was doing wasn't a problem.
Yeah, sure.
Because, externally, I've got these acceptances and scholarships, and, whether or not I'm doing well in school no longer matters, because I'm just ready to move on from high school and get to college. And, at that point, I just gave up any effort to even try to make an attempt in school, and things really from there started to suffer.
It's funny because I can relate growing up in the suburbs like that. You're from a family where it doesn't seem like you had to want for anything as a kid, regardless what's going on behind the scenes, or, as far as I knew, everything was being handled. And it's like born on third base, thought I hit a triple. I've heard a guy say that. And that sounds like your experience. Everything is going well. I mean, and you're smart, you're popular, you're doing drugs all day in school, and you're not getting consequences. This is a dangerous combination we have going for this guy we're talking about right now.
Yeah, there were really, essentially no consequences up until, the first real consequence I hit was later in my senior year. The school was, not surprisingly catching on, and, they searched me. I was able to hide everything. They couldn't find any drugs on me, but they said, we know you're high. We want you to get a drug test. So that was kind of the first time I was confronted with what I had been doing, because, meanwhile, this whole time I've, in my eyes, successfully hidden this from my parents, from my friends, from everybody. Nobody had any idea what was going on. So I remember my mom gets called. We've got to go after school to Quest Diagnostics, go take a drug test, which I know I'm going to fail.
Yeah.
And I fail. And
what comes up?
So on that one, it was fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it. But at the time, the only thing that showed up on that one was marijuana.
Okay.
So it felt like, it was, I think, for my parents, easier to say, it's, can't believe he's doing it, but it could be worse. They took it seriously, but at the same time, there wasn't, when that happened, which is, I think an area that I hope as a country, as people we're doing better with now, and I think in most cases we are. But when that happened and the school got involved and I failed this drug test, it was never brought up to me that I might have a problem. It was never brought up that maybe I should seek treatment. It was more about just being punitive and, this threat of, if I can't pass a drug test, I'm not going to graduate. And that's how I looked at it, was, they're just trying to punish me. Not that anybody was trying to help me, though. In hindsight, I know my mom and dad only wanted to help me, but I there was no hand that reached out and said, "Hey, do you want to get help?"
Yeah.
Not that I know if I would have been open to it at the time, but it was just different.
Yeah, I mean, it's at that age. Not only was I addicted, but also, as far as it just wasn't. I couldn't even imagine getting help. I just wasn't. I wasn't ready. If I had gotten that hand up, but who knows? It never happened that way for me. So you start to experiment with opioids. Is that towards the tail end of high school?
Yeah, tail end of high school, and then really, once I got into college, that became my only, the only thing I was focused on. In order to put all of my energy towards opioids, I stopped, essentially stopped using everything else, and that became my single sort of just the thing that my life revolved around. And for me, when that happened is where things really dramatically started to fall apart.
Was there a point, Harry, where you were like, as things fell apart, when you were like, okay, I'm not doing this for fun anymore. I'm not doing this, to beat the system. I'm doing this to get by. Was there a specific moment or time frame you can wrap your arms around and share with people?
So there were quite a few. I'd say the most specific and kind of first one that I tried to take action on was, when I was getting these drug tests at the end of my senior year, I knew something wasn't right. And I figured it was just all my friends and everything, this environment I'm in. So I made a decision that I picked a school, College of Charleston, which was, relatively far away. And I knew that nobody I knew was going there.
Yeah.
And I assumed that, when I got to college at this new place, I would do things different, right? Because in my mind at that time, if I could go back to just drinking and maybe smoking marijuana, it would be like it was when I was 14. It wouldn't be that bad. And what happened was, of course, this, we often say wherever we go, we bring ourselves with us.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I got to Charleston, I found all of those things that I had been doing and nothing changed. But that was for me a moment where I recognized pretty early that something's wrong and tried to do something about it, but tried to do something about it without support or really knowing what to do. And unsurprisingly, it failed. But those things continue to happen. And really with the opioids and the withdrawal symptoms, that's where it became just a daily realization that this is a problem. I've got to try to stop. And just I day in and day out proved to myself that I was incapable. I tried so many different things. I tried to wean myself off. I tried to switch substances. I tried anything that I could think of. One of the last things I tried when I was, towards the end of my road was I tried to become a police officer, and I took the exam. I did really well. And then I of course couldn't show up for the physical because I knew I wouldn't pass the drug test. But the most important moment that I had that clarity and sort of in hindsight was a critical moment for me was when I was 20 years old, completely caught up in this. I found out that the girl I was seeing, my girlfriend at the time, was pregnant, and I was going to become a dad. And, I have an incredible father. He's always been a strong father figure in my life. I knew what kind of father I wanted to be. And I knew that drugs weren't in that picture. So when I found this out, instead of feeling sort of overwhelmed and scared, I felt hopeful, right? Because I believed
here's a reason.
And I truly believed in that moment that was going to be the thing that saved me, that just having a baby, my love for my daughter would stop all of this, and I'd, be the person I would want to be. I remember telling my dad when I broke them the news that they were going to become grandparents that, look, I'm going to man up.
Because at the time, they're like, yeah, you got to get it together. They kind of, the walls are closing in on you, I'm assuming.
Yeah. And he shot that idea of me manning up kind of right down, but I didn't believe him. I wanted to prove to him. And what I found was that I was incapable. And I continued to use after my daughter was born. And the internal suffering that I put myself through and experienced as a result of that, every day wanting nothing more than to stop, but every day being incapable, and the justifications of, why I'm doing this, and, that I can't be sick. If I'm in withdrawal, I can't take care of my daughter. Those crazy rationalizations that just kept me stuck for the first year of her life until I went into treatment.
So a couple things, because, and I can relate in a sense where I don't have a child, but my brother, who's sober, I guess 15 or 16 years, same situation as you. He looked to the birth of his daughter, his first daughter, as a way out. And it was just like, he became a tortured soul, because it's like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And then the next thing he knew, he's drinking, he's getting drugs. And it was just like you, like a treacherous first year and a half. And it sounds like the ultimate pain. Some of the pain that you're going through before you get sober, I just want to touch on. You write about and talk about a story where there was a home invasion you were involved in. And it's something that you just kind of at the time wrote off. And this shows the insanity. It's just part of the lifestyle. You know, if I'm going to live in this world, it's almost like a mob hit. You know, hey, guys in the mob, if you're in, it's easy to rub them out, right? Because that's the lifestyle they've chosen. And you've chosen this lifestyle of being a drug addict. So this home invasion for you is another day at the office?
Yeah, at the time, you know, and it's remarkable to think about in the context of my life. And you mentioned earlier, you know, I grew up in a wonderful home in the suburbs. You know, my family was, you know, we're really fortunate. I didn't have to want for much, but my drug use had me spending essentially all of my time in North Philly, where the environment I was in was an environment that I sought out, and it was nothing like the loving, caring environment of my home. And, you know, that night when the home invasion happened, you know, it really did two things. One, you know, it did feel like this is what happens, right? And part of that was the realization that I had recognized that, you know, even though I wasn't the one committing the home invasion, through my drug use, I recognized that I could be capable of that, right? Because I had so many times proved to myself that I was capable of all of these things that I thought were morally wrong that led to my shame. I continued to lie. I stole. And if I could do all of these things, of course, people are going to rob me. You know, so it felt like understandable. And it just felt like something that was part of the life that I was stuck in, that those things happen.
And so stuff like this is happening. Now, we mentioned your mother, Madeleine Dean. She's getting ready for a run at the State House, and you are now bottoming out. You're in free fall. You write about you're stealing money from your parents. She writes about it. And I think the end of this, correct me if I'm wrong, is there's about $4,000 in one night that you take. And you say that, and this is exactly how I felt when I got help. You were just out of lies, man. You were out of gas. You're confronted for the umpteenth time. And what happens? What do you say? What are you feeling? And what leads to that moment of clarity where you finally get some help?
So part of it was, I had, over the course of a couple of weeks, I started, you know, stealing from my parents. And like I said, within a couple of weeks, it was about $4,000. And it, you know, it started off slow. I promised I'd repay it. And it got to a point where I knew I couldn't. And, you know, it was a Friday night. I remember it vividly. You know, even though I'm stealing, I then go on a Friday night to ask my mom, say, hey, I need a little bit of money. And she tells me there's something wrong with the bank account. And she can't give me any money and doesn't say anything else. And I knew in that moment I was caught.
Yeah.
I knew she was going to figure it out. You know, whether she knew already or not, I didn't know, but I knew she was going to figure it out. And I started trying to figure out what I'm going to say. How am I going to justify this? How am I going to spin it? And from Friday until Tuesday, I tried to figure that out because I wasn't confronted by my parents until the following Tuesday. So I had all of this time just torturing myself trying to justify what I had done or explain it or find a way to come up with the money. And by the time they confronted me, I recognized that I just had nothing. And I also felt like I had nothing to lose because I had accepted that this is just who I was, and there was no way out for me. So when they confronted me with the truth that I had been stealing and asked me if I wanted to get help, instead of spinning that story that I always spun, I had nothing in me. I just said yes because I couldn't see any other option at the time. And you know, and that's not to say in that moment I had this sense of hope that, you know, I'm going to find recovery. I was just at a moment of complete brokenness where I didn't know what to do other than just throw my hands up.
And I love that. I think I read it either in the People magazine or the Philly Inquirer that you just had. They asked you if you were ready to get help and you just had the one word answer, yes. And did you feel a sense of relief when that comes out of your mouth?
A huge sense of relief, because for, I guess I'm 22 at this time. And, for the past 8 years, I've been guarding this secret about my use every single day. I've never admitted to it. I've never spoken about it. And if you hold on to something that tight for that long, that's surrounded with as much shame as that is, to finally let go and just say yes was an incredible relief.
And so you go to treatment. How did you end up? You and I went to the same place, and it's, in my opinion, and I'm sure yours is too, because you're a part of the solution there, working with them at Caron. They churn out miracles. How did you get connected with the folks at Caron, and how did you end up there?
So I love the work that Caron does, and I love that we have that connection, because I think it, there's so many layers to connection. There's, we're connected through recovery, but I think just connected through that experience also adds a lot, right? So we know kind of what helped us get started in this journey. But for me, there were two things. One was, more kind of serendipitous. My great uncle, who lived with my family, had been an oblate priest, and he actually knew Dick and Catherine Caron from decades before. And my mom had gone to. And
for those who don't know, that's Dick Caron, right? He starts up. It's called Chit Chat back in the day, and it evolves into this rehab. So go ahead.
And Chit Chat was founded more than 60 years ago. It's really a way to help alcoholics, and just through that mission of just trying to help others find recovery. But so my mom had this connection, to Caron and to Chit Chat from way back. But another thing that was also really important was, when I was going through this and trying to find ways to continue to hide it, she was trying to figure out what was going on. She could see through it, but she didn't know what to do. And she also was, in a lot of senses in denial. So she went to, Caron has a parent support group. And she went to a support group, but she knew someone there, and she got, coffee that she says was the longest coffee of her life. She ended up talking to this woman for hours, about what we were going through. And my mom was able to find relatability and guidance and hope and insight through that conversation, so that she knew when they confronted me, it was lined up. I was going to go to Caron. She had her mind set on it. And, when they asked me if I wanted to get help and I said yes, it was a matter of minutes before I was on the phone with the admissions team at Caron and packing my bags and in the car.
Yeah, I want to stop you right there, because this is not, you're a professional. I'm not. I'm just somebody with experience. But I've talked to professionals about this, and if people are listening to what Harry just shared with us, that is something that has been shared with me, that if you've got somebody in your life that's struggling and that is really, like we talked about, use the term I did, in free fall, that it is, if you have the means or you have the support system or the people around you, that when that person says they are ready to go, that you are ready to go along with them, right? That you're on the phone. It's a matter of minutes, because if you give us more time, dude, if you give an alcoholic or a drug addict another 12 hours, they may be on another run where they may die on, or they may wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I feel better today. I'm good. To capitalize on that vulnerability is a way to save a life sometimes.
Absolutely. The window of opportunity for me, I felt sort of came and went. There were different times along my journey that I would have been open to it, and I wasn't, the help didn't feel available. But it was so important to have it available right when the opportunity came.
So you go to Caron, And what starts to change? What starts to happen as you start to experience or embrace recovery?
So a lot of things happened. And, I always say when I went into treatment, I didn't know, there wasn't a single person in my life that I could identify that was in recovery. So I didn't know what recovery meant, what it could look like, what was going to come next. But the things that I noticed when I got to Caron were, one, a community and a sense of relatability that I had never experienced for the first time, being around people that understood exactly how I felt without me even having to tell them, that had experienced the same things. And really importantly, that were willing enough and vulnerable enough to share those things with me, because there were things that I thought I could never share or open up about. And something that, there's a guy, Father Bill, who sadly has passed, but was just a staple forever at Caron and did incredible work. And he said something to me that I'm certain he said to anybody who had listened, but it really started a perspective shift in my mind as to what I was going through. And, he just said, Harry, you're not a bad person trying to be good. You're a sick person trying to get well. And for me, that little change in perspective opened my mind, because before that, I truly believed that I was a bad person to my core. And because of that, nothing was going to change. But it also opened up this idea that if I'm sick, I can get better. If I'm sick, things can change. They can improve. But I need to do some things about it. And, going through the process at Caron, I struggled a lot. I had a really hard time letting go and, getting honest and opening up. But I listened and I took it seriously. And, something that was critical for me was just to have that community of people that I could relate to. So I was in the young adult men's program, which put me just with other guys who are around my age. So it made it easier for me to quickly come in and relate and not point to somebody because they're a lot older than me, or, somebody that I couldn't identify with. What Caron did, in a sense, was really kind of take that opportunity for me to back myself out of it away, so that I immediately just dove into this community of people that I could identify with, that had been through what I had been through. And we were all trying to find this way into recovery together.
Yeah. And you're there for 4 months. For me, it was, or maybe you were involved in some arm with Caron for 4 months, but I read 4 months, and I could relate to that because I was a month at Caron and I think 4 months at a place called Maryland Recovery Partners at the time. I don't think it's around anymore, but Caron kind of funneled me there. And the long-term treatment for me was, I believe, why I'm still sober today. I just don't think I was ready to go back out after 30 days. I had tried going to 12-step meetings, and it didn't take. That's my story. And it did take when for me, a pivotal moment was when I said, yeah, I'll go to this. Because at that point, somehow, I whether they would have let me come home or not, the decision at least felt like mine. And I remember finally starting to take advice and saying, yeah, I'll go to this long-term, it was a halfway house, but I'll go. And my life changed. Somebody told me it's a couple months for the rest of your life. And damn, if that wasn't spot on. So for you to be there for that long term, how did that affect you at the time, and your ability to stay sober?
So I think I agree with, really everything that you just said. So I was at Caron for a month, and then I also went to, a really structured sober living environment for 3 months after that. And I'll say, at one level, it was incredibly hard. Right?
Yeah,
I was in treatment.
Totally.
I had a new baby at home, and I had, this sense inside myself that I've got to get back for my daughter. But something that Caron did I think, just an incredible job with was involving the family in treatment so that I wasn't just going through this process by myself. Because if it was just me, I would have gone straight home after, right? But what they did was they involved and included my family and helped them understand what I was going through and how they can support me. And then as a family, everybody really recognized that I needed more time. And I think that, looking at treatment, taking a step back, right, and this kind of me looking from today, but it's so important to look at treatment as, treatment for an ongoing mental health brain disorder, right? And not this episodic treatment of, I viewed rehab as you go to rehab for 28 days, you go home, you're good. And that's not how it works, right? It's an ongoing process of healing that for me really did require that, I needed more time in a really structured environment. I didn't want to do it. But like you said, making that decision to continue and do 3 more months, which felt like the longest amount of time I could imagine in that moment. But in hindsight, it's just a moment in time in a life, and what it gave me in terms of a foundation for recovery that I can build the rest of my life on is almost undescribable.
Yeah, and that family component you spoke about, I have an experience, somebody in my life who went to Caron. It didn't take, they're still out there like so many of us it happens to, but his family was a part of that ride, right? And when I say ride, I mean in a positive sense of going to Caron, visiting with everyone there, visiting with their relative who was sick with this disease. And that family is more united than ever on the other side of this. They know how to handle their loved one who's still out there, who's, it's day to day. I know personally I was as hopeless as you could possibly be. And then, and then I wasn't anymore. But it can go both ways, right? Somebody can get it, and it can be this beautiful story. And maybe somebody doesn't get it, but the family still knows how to deal with them not getting it through this, like you mentioned, this all-encompassing treatment, which I just think is so important because the family is so affected by this. I mean, you back to you real quick, and this is just so interesting. Your mother is about to launch her campaign to run for the state house now with U.S. House, and you're hitting bottom, and she's sending you to treatment. I mean, that you need help to figure that out if you're your mother. I can only imagine.
Absolutely, and I give her a lot of credit for the work and sort of effort that she had put in before to know that, when that moment came, she didn't hesitate, right? She knew what she had to do. She had to draw a boundary. But yeah, it was hard. It was, I went to treatment exactly a week before her first major election, a week to the day. It was Tuesday the week before. So, the house, it was a whirlwind, but what you talked about in terms of the family and, I think it's so important, if any parents are listening, but the importance for the whole family system to heal. And that only happens if each person is trying to heal individually, because even if I were to recover and go back to an environment where my whole family is still struggling.
Yeah. The other side of that.
It's not going to help, it's not going to help my recovery, and it's not going to help them. So I think, knowing that everybody deserves an opportunity to heal from this, because, it's so hard on the parent. It's, and if it is your parent that's struggling, it's so hard on the kids. It doesn't matter who it is, but, if you have that connection to somebody, whether you're the identified patient or you're a loved one is the one that's struggling, I mean, everybody needs an opportunity to heal.
And if you get to rehab, if you're at all like me, because your mother's undergoing this major life event, you probably feel like a real shithead, because it's like the smoke starts to clear. You're like, oh man. But like, that is the disease talking too, right? I mean, like, you're a sick guy. And from my own experience, there's no better place to feel like a shithead than a place where you can get well and you're around people that'll help you heal. And you start taking yourself less seriously, and life starts to become fun again. And for you, it looks like it's a lot of fun. And what you're doing now, you're creating, you're packing stuff into the stream of life with 2 books we mentioned, Under Our Roof and You're Always Loved. And you're also, you get married. By the way, how do you start, for people that listen to this, I always try to ask a guy like you or somebody that's sober and seems like they're really living life like a loose shirt. How do you start to date again? Like, how do you meet a woman? You're married now, you have a beautiful family, but how does that come together?
So for me, that was something that, was really important, right? Was to find a new relationship. And a big part of that, which can sound cliche, all it does, but it was so important to be able to develop a relationship with myself first, to learn how to sit by myself and be alone before I tried to fill that with somebody else. Because that's what when I was struggling, I always had a girlfriend, always, because they provided me the self-validation that I couldn't pull from within. So for me, in terms of trying to date again, is really developing that self-esteem and self-worth within myself first, so that I could be a healthy partner. And with my wife, it turned out that we formed an incredible friendship first, and we were friends before we started dating. And, that has been just an incredible foundation for our relationship that's been so rewarding.
And what is your life like today? What do you do to stay sober? It's clear what you do as far as service is concerned through your work with Caron, but what do you do to stay fit spiritually and to stay, like I said, living life like a loose garment?
So my life today looks, it every year looks a little bit different. When I first got into recovery, I was going to meetings every single day. What it looks like today is my life is incredibly full, but it's full with fulfilling things that really make me feel good about what I'm doing. And, so part of it is definitely, I still get to meetings. I'm still involved with my own recovery process in a meaningful way. But also what my life looks like is, I have 3 kids now. I've got a wife. I live in New Jersey. I've, worked in Washington, D.C. I'm back in school. My days are, incredibly busy. But it's a life that I've created. It's a life that I, wanted to live. When I was about 6 years into recovery is when I reached out. I was working this job. I was in sales management. It was, great experience. I got to travel the world, do a lot of exciting new things.
You were working in cycling, right?
Yeah,
that's cool.
So I spent a ton of time traveling, and it was a really rewarding experience. But it wasn't, for me, it didn't have the fulfillment that necessarily I was looking for. And that's, I think, one of the real benefits for me of recovery is being able to make decisions that are hard decisions, right? About a career path, about something else, and really look at what's best for me. Not to just always be chasing, the money or the next thing. And, I reached out to Caron to try to find an opportunity to go work for an organization that I so truly believe in, and not just because I went there and I had a great experience, but like you look at, I get excited whenever I look at Caron and the things that are happening, in terms of like new outcome studies that have just come out where, the readmission rate for somebody to go back into treatment who's left Caron is less than 6%. So you've got about 90 at 90 days. So you've got about 94% sort of recovery rate at 90 days post-treatment, which is remarkable across this industry. And looking at what we're doing for, really developing a new research center to really just drive this field forward. Like those are the things today that the research, the ability to try to help somebody else, to try to like have an opportunity to do a podcast like this and tell my story so that maybe, just maybe, somebody might hear it and identify and recognize that recovery is possible. The life that I have today is a life that I've designed to be just incredibly fulfilling and rewarding. And the most exciting thing is, that it's not done, right? I'm still young. I still have so much ahead of me. And that is,
what are you, 30, 31, 32?
Yeah, I'm 31.
That's
and
awesome.
I remember, I remember the vision I had for my life in my very early recovery, when I started to see that recovery was possible. And I had this vision, and it was such a small vision for what I could accomplish over a lifetime. But I surrounded myself with people in recovery who really just opened my mind to what is possible, and what to just expand my horizon, because, living the life of substance use disorder and just caught up in that, I had ingrained in myself that I wasn't capable of more, but through recovery, I've been able to see that really anything is possible.
One thing
we can live lives that are fulfilling.
And your life is certainly fulfilling. And the one thing I like that you said, which I need to lean more on, right? Because day to day, it's not all unicorns and rainbows, but your life, you designed it. As much as there are things around us happening that we can't control, you are now in control of Harry and the decisions you make. Whereas before, dude, we were just in the wind, right? I mean, and we were going down the drain. Or even today, when we're not working a program, I find other people making decisions for me, or I find myself in circumstances, and I'm like, hey, well, how did this happen? Well, it happened because you just went along, or something like that. Last question for you before we let you get on with this fulfilling life of yours. You're going to meetings today. What do you tell somebody that comes up to you and says, hey, I'm just trying to get a day? Like, how can I stop? What do I do? What do I do to stop drinking or using? What do you share with them?
What if it's somebody like that? What I try to do is really share, one at the foundation, hope, right? That it is possible. Because I know when I was there, when I just wanted to get one day, I wish somebody would have told me that it was possible, because everybody that I was surrounded with made me feel like it wasn't possible. So to share hope, but I think in order to do that, we've got to share authentically about what I went through. Because if I talk about my life today to my former self when I was trying to get a day, I wouldn't believe myself.
Yeah.
I wouldn't see myself in myself. So being able to go back and identify it, and that's where, again, it doesn't matter what you use, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, it doesn't matter. Being able to identify with those feelings of this sort of deep shame and hopelessness, or whatever somebody's going through, to say that I've been there, and I didn't necessarily believe that it would get better either, but somebody convinced me that if I stuck with this, that maybe, just maybe, recovery is possible. And with that little bit of open-mindedness, that maybe this is possible, I gave it a try. And things started to happen that I didn't believe would happen, but in hindsight, they were all the things that people were telling me.
Yeah, it's a life beyond our wildest dreams if we'll get out of the way. At least for me, that's how it works. And dude, your story is amazing. You're an amazing guy. I will put a link to both the books and a way people can get in touch with you at Caron, on this podcast. And again, thank you for carrying the message and for the work you do, and for digging in and spending time with me today. I know I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking with you and getting to know you a little bit better.
All right, Harry, you're the man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to The Payoff with Pete. Once again, I'm Pete Souza. And of course, we are part of the Rogue Media Network. All kinds of good podcasts you can find at roguemedianetwork.com. And of course, you can find this podcast and all those other ones wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, other spots like that.
This has been a Rogue Media podcast.